Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. It goes without saying it's a great, great pleasure to have been invited here to speak today. And I have to tell you, I know why I was invited to speak here today. It's probably because you knew about my close, personal, intimate relationship with the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And if you don't know about it, I'm going to tell you about it right now. And I'm sure there are people here in the room who've heard somebody say, I was a student of Dr. King's. But Dr. King only taught one time, only taught one class, only 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. I'm one of the 8 people in the universe who honestly can say I was a student of Martin Luther King's. Now, I wish I could tell you I'd had the wit to take extensive notes in class, and I kept those notes until today, but I didn't do that. I wish I could tell you I had the wit to bring a tape recorder to class. I had tape recorded the pearls of wisdom that fell from the lips of this marvelous man, but I didn't do that either. In fact, I'm not ashamed to say that I remember nothing that passed between teacher and student in the class. But I do remember one day, class was over. He and I were walking across the beautiful, beautiful Morehouse College campus. And I turned to him and I said, Doc, his friends called him Doc. I said, Doc, how you doing? He said, Julian, I'm not doing well. He said, unemployment is high, racism is everywhere, discrimination seems immovable. He said, I feel awful. I have a nightmare. I said, no, Doc, turn that around, try I have a dream. And I sense doubt. At any rate, for a non-lawyer like me, it's always an honor to appear before lawyers and others in the legal field, as long as it's not in a courtroom. My first appearance before a judge was in a courtroom when I was 20 years old. It was March of 1960 during the Jim Crow era. I'd led a group of my fellow students to the segregated cafeteria in the basement of Atlanta City Hall. We passed along the steam table loading our trays, and as first in line, I approached the cashier. Like most Southerners, she was polite, and she told me, I'm awfully sorry. This is for City Hall employees only. I said, you have a big sign out front that says City Hall cafeteria. The public is welcome. We don't mean it, she said. And she called the police, who came and locked us up. Because nearly 200 of us had been arrested that day in various places around Atlanta, it was decided to try one person for each group, and I was chosen to be tried for mine. For the first time in my life, I stood before a judge. On either side of me were 2 men whom I'd never seen or met before. I quickly understood they were my lawyers. And after some back and forth between my lawyers and the judge, which I didn't understand, the judge addressed me and asked, how do you plead? And I was panic-stricken. On the one hand, I thought perhaps I was guilty. Policeman had asked me to move, I didn't move, and I disobeyed a lawful order by a policeman, and so I must be guilty. On the other hand, I had a right to be in this tax-supported cafeteria. I'm a taxpayer of Georgia, and so I didn't feel guilty at all. And I knew that any law that said I couldn't be there was really no law worth respecting at all. So I desperately looked to my left, where the older of my 2 lawyers was standing. I found out later he was the dean of black lawyers in Georgia. He had risked life and limb for nearly 50 years, representing black people in small-town courthouses where he dare not spend the night. And now in his dotage, he was fast asleep. With fear in my heart, I turned frantically to my right, to the younger of these 2 men, and he said to me in a stage whisper, not guilty, you fool. And I had the presence of mind to drop those last 2 words, or I might not be standing here now. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but my wife, Pamela Horowitz, is, and she's allowed me to tell you that one of her judicial heroes, and mine, Judge Frank M. Johnson dismissed within hours of its filing the first lawsuit she ever filed, declaring the complaint to be verbose, prolix, and argumentative. The dismissal was without prejudice, allowing her to refile and eventually to win that case, the first of many she'd argue before Judge Johnson. Now, Johnson, as you may know, was a profile in judicial courage. He was a Republican from the Free State of Winston, a northern Alabama county that voted to secede from Alabama when Alabama voted to secede from the Union. He spent 24 years as a federal district judge in Montgomery. As a member of a 3-judge federal court, he ended the Montgomery bus boycott by ruling bus segregation unconstitutional. This would be followed by rulings striking down segregation and discrimination in every facet of Alabama life: schools, parks, jury selection, higher education, voting, legislative reapportionment. He put Alabama's prison system, highway patrol, property tax assessment program, mental health agency, public education system, all under the federal court's jurisdiction. But he was far from alone in his judicial heroism. As Claude Sitton, who served as Southern correspondent for the New York Times in the early 1960s, put it, "Those who think Martin Luther King desegregated the South don't know Elbert Tuttle and the record of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals." The Fifth Circuit, to which Judge Johnson would eventually be elevated, then encompassed the 6 states of the old Confederacy, including Chief Judge Tuttle's and my own native Georgia. After the landmark Brown system struck down school segregation, and with it the doctrine of separate but equal, Senator James O. Eastland told a cheering audience in Senatobia, Mississippi. He said, "On May 17, 1954, the Constitution of the United States was destroyed because the Supreme Court disregarded the law and decided that integration was right. You are not required to obey any court which passes out such a ruling. In fact," Senator Eastland said, "you are obligated to defy it." It was in this atmosphere that the Fifth Circuit would be called upon to turn Brown's promise into reality and to expand it beyond the schoolhouse. Its judges would strike down barriers to equality in voting, jury selection, employment, in the process formulating the remedy of affirmative action, the just spoils of a righteous war. At great personal sacrifice, these judges took the nation and the South from white-robe Klan violence to black-robe justice and helped to save us from ourselves. But they didn't always get it right. In 1966, I was the plaintiff in a case that grew from my first election to the Georgia House of Representatives. A federal lawsuit had reapportioned the Georgia General Assembly, reconstituting a legislature where the cows and horses were better represented than human beings. Having created new equal districts in urban Fulton County, the courts had ordered selections for a 1-year term. As a successful candidate for one of these new seats, I was to take the oath of office on January 10, 1966. A week earlier, Samuel Young, Jr., a Tuskegee Institute student and a colleague of mine with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was shot and killed while trying to use the segregated bathroom at a Tuskegee service station. He needed to use the bathroom more than most people because during his Navy service, including the Cuban blockade, he had lost a kidney. And the irony of his losing a life because of an illness suffered in service to his country prompted SNCC to issue an anti-war statement. We became the first organization to link the prosecution of the Vietnam War with the persecution of blacks at home. We issued a statement which accused the United States of deception in its claims of concern for the freedom of colored people in such countries as the Dominican Republic, the Congo, South Africa, Rhodesia, and in the United States itself. The United States is no respecter of persons or laws, we said, when such persons or laws run counter to its needs and desires. Well, the statement created a sensation. I was SNCC's communications director, and when I appeared to take the oath of office on January 10, 1966, hostility from white legislators was nearly absolute. They prevented me from taking the oath, they declared my seat vacant, and ordered another election to fill the vacancy. I won that election and was expelled again. By the time I approached a third election, this time for a regular 2-year term, I had filed suit in federal court. Judge Griffin Bell, later to become Attorney General in the Carter administration, wrote the majority decision for the three-judge federal court, which refused to overturn the legislature's decision to deny me the seat to which I had been twice elected. Judge Tuttle dissented. His view was adopted by a unanimous United States Supreme Court, and a year after my first attempt, I became a member of the Georgia House of Representatives. Before the three-judge court, I was represented by the late Charles Morgan, Jr., then of the Southern Regional Office of the ACLU, and later my wife's law partner, and Howard Moore, later my sister's partner-in-law and partner in life. For the appeal to the Supreme Court, I secured the services of Victor Rabinowitz and Leonard Boudin. Now, I'd never been to the Supreme Court. As I sat and listened to Georgia's Attorney General Arthur Bolton argue that Georgia had a right to refuse to seat me, I found myself hypnotically nodding in agreement. Victor Rabinowitz elbowed me and said, "Stop that, you fool." Not the first time I'd been so addressed by my lawyer. But during Bolton's argument, Justice Byron White interrupted him and asked, "Is that all you have? You come all this way and that's all you have?" And I elbowed Rabinowitz and said, "We're winning, aren't we?" He said, "Yes, we were, and indeed we did." Chief Justice Earl Warren's opinion in Bond v. Floyd was more than a victory for the First Amendment. It was a reaffirmation of my constituents' right to free choice in casting their votes. And it was a reaffirmation of the centrality of the legal system in our lives. Lawyers, as Charles Hamilton Houston used to say, can be either social engineers or parasites on society. Houston, who devised the litigation strategy of the NAACP against state-sanctioned segregation, and who taught Thurgood Marshall how to practice law, said a lawyer had 5 obligations: to be prepared to anticipate, guide, and interpret group advancement, to be the mouthpiece of the weak and the sentinel guarding against wrong, to ensure the course of change is orderly with a minimum of human loss and suffering, to use the law as an instrument available to the minority to achieve its place in the community and the nation, and to engage in a carefully planned program of arousing and strengthening the local will to struggle. The NAACP retained Houston as special counsel in 1934. He was one of a small group of black lawyers who came of age during the New Deal years. They and the NAACP shared a mutual dependency and mutual admiration. Although Houston and Marshall, his protege and successor, are synonymous with the NAACP's litigation successes, the NAACP pursued an innovative litigation strategy from its inception in 1909, 100 years ago. An early board chairman had been president of the American Bar Association. All but one member of its earliest legal committee were white, recruited from the upper rungs of the New York City bar. But it would be Houston's legal vision that would not only lead the NAACP to its great victories, but also have a deep and lasting impact on how we think today about public interest law. A lawyer's job, a judge's job, doing justice is often a struggle. And doing justice often means taking power from those who have it and giving it to those who do not. In this high-tech age, we hear a lot about the digital divide. But not long ago, the ABA Journal ran a piece called "Divided Justice," noting that today there are still 2 views of the law, one black and one white. A survey commissioned by the ABA Journal and the National Bar Association magazine revealed the divide separating black and white lawyers. When asked about how much racial bias exists in the justice system, 52% of black lawyers said very much, while only 6% of white lawyers agreed. More than 90% of black lawyers thought the justice system was as or more racially biased than other segments of society, an opinion held by fewer than half of white lawyers. Not surprisingly, almost 67% of black lawyers said they had witnessed racial bias in the justice system within the previous 3 years, while only 16% of white lawyers said they had done so. In every area surveyed, racial profiling, environmental justice, jury configuration, judicial appointments, law firm diversity, minority law clerks, affirmative action, black and white lawyers stood on opposite sides of a racial divide. A later study, sponsored by the Department of Justice, confirmed that black and white youth stand on opposite sides of a justice divide. At every step in the juvenile justice system, black and Hispanic youth are treated more severely than comparable whites. Minority youth are more likely to be arrested, to be held in jail, sent for trial, convicted, and given longer prison terms. Among young people charged with a violent crime who've not been in juvenile prison previously, black teenagers are 9 times more likely than whites to be sentenced to juvenile prison. Black youths charged with drug offenses are 48 times more likely than their white counterparts to receive such a sentence. Beyond these numbers, there are names. In the 1960s, we used to say that military justice was an oxymoron. Now we have to say the same about juvenile justice. But nowhere is the public trust more important than in the justice system. Nowhere, perhaps, is it more difficult to attain. Trust in public and private institutions has been on the decline in this country for decades, and courts are not immune. Nor are courts immune from the problems of the larger society in which they function: wealth-based disparities, political favoritism, unfair treatment of racial and ethnic minorities. So it's not surprising that in another survey conducted in 2000, respondents' views about the courts and their communities differed greatly among whites, African Americans, and Latinos. In almost all of their assessments of fairness of court outcomes and procedures, blacks were less favorable than whites, sometimes markedly so. A feeling that courts treat people with respect was strongest among whites. Among recent court users, whites were more than twice as likely as blacks to view court procedures as always or usually fair. The difference between white and black jurors was particularly stark. Although 63% of white jurors believe court outcomes are always or usually fair, only 17% of black jurors shared that perception. A lack of trust in the courts among blacks was palpable. A majority expressed the views that their group is treated worse than others. In American courts, as in American law, as in American life, it is race, not class, not gender, but race, that dictates both perception and reality. Judge Johnson, whom I mentioned earlier, understood this. He told the Boston University School of Law commencement in 1979, religious differences, race differences, sex differences, age differences, political differences are not the same. It is no mark of intellectual soundness to treat them as if they were. Moreover, if the life of the law has been experienced, then law should be realistic enough to treat certain issues as special, as racism is special in American history. A judiciary that cannot declare that is of little value. The removal over the decades of the 1950s and 1960s of the most blatant forms of American apartheid, and now Barack Obama's electoral success have made it too easy for too many to believe that all forms of discrimination have disappeared. But President Obama's victory does not herald a post-civil rights America or mean that race as an issue has been vanquished. It will not end structural inequality or racist attitudes. In one survey, 8 out of 10 said it was important to have persons of different races, cultures, and backgrounds in the workforce. Even more, 85% thought diversity important to the quality of higher education. Before the Supreme Court upheld the legality of affirmative action, in the University of Michigan cases in 2004, a majority of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals said in upholding race-conscious admissions to law school that diversity has the potential to enrich everyone's education and thus make a law school stronger than the sum of its parts. The dissent proposed that the law school pursue experiential diversity in a race-neutral manner. I am cited in this dissenting opinion, not, I'm happy to say, in favor of this proposition. The notion of race-neutral diversity would allow diversity to become a dodge to avoid race, just as the notion of colorblindness. As Jeffrey Lehman, the dean of Michigan's law school, writes, colorblindness is an ideal, not an idol, and the Constitution does not require us to sacrifice effective education and integration in its name. Or as I like to put it, whether race is a burden or a benefit is all the same to these theorists. That is what they mean when they speak of being colorblind. They are colorblind, all right, blind to the consequences of being the wrong color in America today. The evidence is everywhere. A sweeping 5-year study concluded that race still determines success in everything from job opportunities to education to housing. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, was one of the first social theorists to link class to race. He understood then what we must understand now: race never stands apart from economic equalities. The fragility of middle-class life for black Americans is illustrated by their downward mobility. Nearly half of all blacks born into the middle class 40 years ago have now descended into poverty or near poverty as adults, compared to only 16% of whites. While the nation as a whole is more racially and ethnically diverse now than at any time in our history, white Americans still choose to live largely segregated lives. Our racial and ethnic populations are unevenly distributed, meaning that many white Americans have little contact, if any, with people not like themselves. More than 1/2 of all minorities live in just 5 states: California, Texas, New York, Florida, and Illinois. 55% of all blacks live in the South. 61% of Hispanics live in 5 southwestern states. Among Asians and Pacific Islanders, half live in the West, as do half of all Indians, Eskimos, and Aleuts. With the emergence of more multiracial and multi-ethnic neighborhoods comes confirmation that not all differences are created equal. Segregation among Latinos and Asians is often transitory, an immediate byproduct of immigration. Black segregation is different and longer lasting, tending toward the permanent. The reasons why are rooted in the Confederacy. Its vice president said, its foundations are laid on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. No other ethnic group, with the exception of American Indians, experienced a comparable mix of xenophobic, attitudinal, and structural limitations on their development. It is absolutely without parallel in the American experience. Our lives may reflect this, but our laws do not. Today, through executive order, court decisions, and legislative acts, the protected classes extend to a majority of all Americans, including white ethnics, the aged, short people, the chemically dependent, the left-handed, the obese, and all religions. We ought to examine how the road to civil rights became so crowded and what the consequences are. We know that race is a socio-political, not a biological construct, but there are more differences within races than there are between them. But if race has only socio-political, not biological significance, we know it's not a pigment of our imagination. It colors all our lives and has profound consequences in the lives of many. As John Hope Franklin writes, all whites benefited from American slavery. All blacks had no rights they could claim as their own. All whites, including the vast majority who owned no slaves, were not only encouraged but authorized to exercise dominion over all slaves, thereby adding to the system of control. Even poor whites, Dr. Franklin writes, benefited from the legal advantage they enjoyed over all blacks, as well as from the psychological advantage of having a group beneath them. Most living Americans do have a connection with slavery. They have inherited the preferential advantage if they are white and the loathsome disadvantage if they are black, and these positions are virtually as alive today as they were in the 19th century. Just as the black man was only 35 years removed from slavery at the beginning of the 20th century, so was the black man only 35 years removed from segregation when the 21st century began. As we meet, it has been less than 45 short years since all black Americans were promised the full rights of citizens. Less than 45 years since legal segregation was ended nationwide. Less than 45 years since the right to register and vote was universally guaranteed. Less than 45 years since the protections of the law and Constitution were officially guaranteed to all. And now some are telling us those 45 years have been enough. The country seems proud, and rightly so, that a candidate campaigning in cities where he could not have stayed in a hotel 45 years ago has now won election to the nation's highest office. We know one man climbing the mountaintop doesn't mean the climb is over for everyone else. Or as we like to say, the initials NAACP don't stand for the National Association for the Advancement of One Colored Person. At the same time, Barack Obama's victory was more than the victory of one man. An energized people said yes to justice, yes to equality, yes to peace. We now have a chance to redeem the promise of our government, to reclaim our democracy, not for all, not for oil, to put mutual obligations over mutual funds, to put the public interest over private wealth, to restore government lawyers to the role of promoters of the rule of law rather than the enablers of torture. On his second day in office, President Obama nullified every legal order and opinion on interrogations issued by any lawyer in the executive branch after September 11, 2001. This magic moment in our nation's history has everything to do with the work of the modern movement for civil rights and the work the NAACP has waged for more than 100 years. It was fitting that Obama gave his acceptance speech as his party's nominee exactly 45 years to the day after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. For his inaugural, He rode to Washington on a private railroad car built in the 1930s, when being a Pullman porter was the best job a black man could hope to have and the worst job on a train. He was sworn in front of the National Mall, which had been the site of a slave market. He took the oath standing on the steps of the Capitol, built by slaves who cut the timber, baked the bricks, and laid the stone for its foundation. He then moved into the White House, also built by slaves. One of the tools which helped eliminate slavery's legacy was affirmative action, created to fight what Supreme Court Justice Sandra O'Connor called the unhappy persistence of both the practice and the lingering effects of racial discrimination. Affirmative action is now under attack not because it has failed, but because it is a great success. It created a sizable middle class that constitutes 1/3 of all black Americans today, women and men with jobs and homes and education. Some argue that affirmative action carries some kind of stigma with it that attaches to all black people, whether beneficiaries or not, as if blacks suffered no stigma before the words affirmative action were ever spoken. Why is this argument never made about the millions of whites who got into college as a legacy because dad was an alumnus, or got a job because dad was president of a company, or president of the United States? You never see these people walking around with their heads held low, moaning that everyone in the executive washroom is whispering about how they got their job. No one suggests that white women, affirmative action's greatest beneficiaries, are suffering any crisis of self-confidence. Since the nation was founded, all our elite professions have been the special preserve of white men, and they remain largely so today. From membership in the House, Speaker Pelosi notwithstanding, and in the Senate to the heads of Fortune 500 companies, to the tenured faculty of the nation's colleges and universities, to partnerships at major law firms. I seriously doubt if a single one of these men is suffering from low self-esteem, because he knows, everyone knows, his race and gender helped him win his job. Look at it this way. It's the fourth quarter of a football game between the white team and the black team. The white team is ahead 145-3. They've been cheating since the game began. The white team owns the ball, the uniforms, the field, the goalpost, and the referees. There are 2 minutes left to play. All of a sudden, the white quarterback, who feels badly about things that happened before he got in the game, turns to the black team and says, "Hey, fellas, can't we just play fair?" Of course, playing fair here is a farce. It's doublespeak for freezing the status quo in place, permanently fixing inequality as part of the American scene. In a cruel irony, the United States Supreme Court observed the 50th anniversary of the integration of Little Rock by gutting Brown v. Board, the historic case which gave birth to the Little Rock case and was supposed to end in-school segregation. Until about 25 years ago, remarkable progress for that goal was made under Brown. Indeed, for most of us, the notion that race ought not to be considered in remedying racial discrimination is ludicrous, and now the ludicrous has become law. The Bush court, on the same day the bald eagle was removed from the endangered species list, removed black children from the law's protection. In 2 cases from Louisville and Seattle, the court held by a 5-4 vote that those school systems could not voluntarily use race in assigning students to schools. The court incredibly ruled that conscious racial integration is the moral equivalent of conscious racial segregation. This is the most radical in a line of cases beginning in the 1980s that question race-conscious policies. In truth, there are no non-racial remedies for racial discrimination. In order to get beyond race, you have to go to race. To suggest racial neutrality as a remedy for racial discrimination is sophistry of the highest order. I not only have spent most of my adult life in the cause of integration, but in 1947, when I was 7 years old, I was a plaintiff in a lawsuit in rural Pennsylvania against segregated schools. As the suit was pending, the school board tried to settle by giving achievement tests to decide which of 2 schools on opposite sides of a country lane students would attend. Most of the black students failed, and all whites passed. The schools remained segregated until the sons of the local white political boss failed the test. Rather than send them to the black school, that school was closed, and all of the village's children went to a 2-room school together. Recently, I visited Berea College in Kentucky, opened by abolitionists as an integrated school in 1855. It was closed by the Civil War, but opened again in 1866 with 187 students, 96 blacks, 91 whites. It dared provide a rare commodity in the former slave states, an education that was open to all, to blacks, to whites, to women, and to men. One of those early students was my grandfather, James Bond. Born a slave, who at age 15, barely able to read and write, hitched his tuition, a steer, to a rope and walked 100 miles across Kentucky to attend Berea College. He belonged to a transcendent generation of black Americans, born into slavery, freed by the Civil War, determined to make their way as free women and men. From Berea, he studied for the ministry, married, had 6 children, one of them my father, Horace Mann Bond. My father graduated from Pennsylvania's Lincoln University, received a doctorate in education from the University of Chicago. For him, too, education was a means to a higher end, the uplift of a people and the salvation of his race. He was asked to contribute to the NAACP's brief in Brown versus Board of Education. He pursued this task with the optimism expressed by his father many years ago. When my grandfather graduated from Berea, the college asked him to deliver the commencement address. He said then, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good or hopeful in the progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that falls across his path, a lurking foe. But he forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that lightning purifies the atmosphere, that hardships and adversity nerve the race, as the individual, for greater efforts and grander victories." Greater efforts and grander victories. That was the promise made by the generation born in slavery more than a century and a half ago. That was the promise made by the generation that brought democracy to America's darkest corners more than 5 decades ago. And that is the promise we must all seek to honor today. Thank you.